My name is Reverend Dr. Mae Elise Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. As I mentioned, this webinar comes to you tonight from CMEP, Churches for Middle East Peace, from Evangelicals for Justice, who've been doing a series on Bonhoeffer. I think this is the third part of the series with E4J. I have the great privilege of being on the board of E4J, and tonight, we're continuing that conversation about how would Bonhoeffer speak to this moment. Tonight is also co-sponsored by NEME, the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. And so we're grateful to all of those organizations. I welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know who you are. If you come here with a question or a hope of what you hope we address tonight, feel free to let us know that. You can let us know where you're joining from. I'm currently in Washington, D.C. I grew up not far from here, off of the Patuxent River in southern Maryland, and that's where I'm joining you from. And I also have news. Rabbi Or Rose had a medical emergency. He's okay, but he had to go and be treated for an incident, and so he's okay. Everything's fine, but he had to have some attention to that. And so he's not able to join us tonight. And so the bad news is that he is in pain and needs to be taken care of. And so we pray for his health and healing in that regard. The good news is that he wants to join us in the future. So this will now be a two-part conversation. And I'm very grateful to Dr. Andrew DeCort, who has agreed to still have the discussion. And so Andrew and I, is it okay if I call you Andrew?
Please.
As we go. Okay. So Andrew and I will talk, just the two of us tonight, and then Rabbi Or and Andrew and I will have a discussion in coming weeks as Rabbi Or recovers. He apologizes. So we're so sorry that just happened a few hours ago. Also, just a few housekeeping things. I think all of you have done Zoom before. I think you all know how it works. I see that you're greeting us from Florida and California and Maryland and New Zealand. I love it. It's amazing. So thank you. Thank you. These are hard and challenging times, and it's a gift to be able to be together. And we want to do so in a spirit of hospitality and welcome. And the prayers that came to mind for me were coming together in the spirit of the fruits of the Spirit. And I don't know if, Andrew, I even verbalized that, but when you prayed over us before we started, you prayed the fruits of the Spirit. And so I want us to come in that spirit as well. I know that people have different viewpoints and perspectives, and so we want to share those in a way that's respectful. We stand against all bigotry and hatred and xenophobia, which has been so prevalent and rampant, and we stand against Islamophobia and the dehumanization of Palestinians and anti-Semitism. And I'm not just using words that are isms, I promise, but I want us, as we're in discourse, and if we disagree and as we ask questions, and we will disagree, right? That's a healthy part of being human, that we try to do so in the way that's respectful and honoring to one another. And we will seek to steward that. So in the chat, if you can seek to use language that seeks to understand. And when we're angry, and there's a lot of anger and a lot of intense emotions, to try to express that in ways that doesn't cause harm, but seeks to address injustices or to rectify and bring reconciliation in ways that are constructive. So I just wanted to state that before we begin. I know you don't need that to be stated, but in some circles, it does need to be articulated. So thank you again for being here. And I'm eager for us to have this discussion. And Andrew, I actually, became familiar with your work on the Beatitudes, not Bonhoeffer. And someone said, well, he's a Bonhoeffer scholar. And I was like, oh, really? Now, I was partial to Andrew's work because we have something in common. I went to the University of Chicago as my undergrad. And that, if you don't know anything about the University of Chicago, is where fun came to die, which means that Andrew is also an academic. So let me tell you a little bit about Andrew, and then I'll stop talking. But let me tell you about Dr. Andrew DeCort. So he's a dissident theologian. That's what he's called by his friends. His work is deeply inspired by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. His writings by James Baldwin, His Spirituality by Eddie Hillesum. I don't know who Eddie Hillesum is, so you'll have to tell us who that is. Andrew received his PhD in religious and political ethics from the University of Chicago. In 2016, he founded the Institute for Faith and Flourishing in Chicago. He co-founded the Neighbor Love Movement in Ethiopia. The Institute for Faith and Flourishing and the Neighboring Love Movement have reached over 20 million people with the invitation to nonviolent spirituality. And that's one of the things I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about the role of violence and pacifism and interventionism. And is violence, how do we respond when there's injustice in the world? Andrew has taught ethics, public theology, peace and conflict studies, Ethiopian studies at Wheaton College, the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology, the University of Bonn. He's the author of Flourishing on the Edge of Faith, 7 Practices for a New We, from Bittersweet Collective, and Bonhoeffer's New Beginning, Ethics After Devastation, from Fortress Academic. His words have appeared in Foreign Policy, the Los Angeles Review of Books, BBC, The Atlantic, The Economist, Christianity Today, Comment Magazine, Sojourners, The Other Journal, Wheaton College Magazine, the Journal of Religion, Political Theology, All Africa, Bittersweet. I'm like, now, I already have a breathing issue, and now I'm really out of breath. So I'm going to just go ... to the rest of the things where all of your publications have been
Yes, please.
Published. But quite prolific you are, Dr. DeCort. Living in Chicago with his wife, Lily, a gentle spirit and a luminous painter. So Dr. Andrew DeCort. Andrew, tell us, so you did your PhD on Bonhoeffer. What do you want us to know? And specifically the question that we're asking tonight is, this moment in the Middle East. And the question is a call to conscience, Bonhoeffer's wisdom for today's trauma in Israel and Palestine. And, we were just saying 70 people killed in Gaza in the last 24 hours. Today's day 540, I'll have to look exactly, right? Trauma. What should we know?
Mae, I want to thank you for your hospitality here in this conversation and the spirit of respect with which you've invited us into it. And I want to add my prayers to yours for Rabbi Orr as he's recovering, and I look forward to the conversation that we will share together and learning from his wisdom. I want to begin, Mae, by naming my deep grief for the abduction and murder of every human life, Palestinian, Israeli, and otherwise, since October 7th, 2023. I also want to name my deep grief for the displacement, death, and destruction of Palestinians that have suffered long before October 7th under the Israeli occupation. And I hope we can agree for everyone in this gathering that no words can adequately express the terrible heartbreak and moral outrage of watching the Israeli military devastate Gaza. We know, as you alluded, that it has killed over 50,000 Gazans, including 15,000 children, that around 2 million of our Gazan neighbors have been displaced from their homes, and that the majority of Gaza's vital infrastructure has now been destroyed. And so I want to begin these remarks by naming my deep sorrow and compassion for all who have suffered and are still suffering. And Mae, during my PhD at the University of Chicago, as you mentioned, I had the gift of studying every surviving word of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And of course, Bonhoeffer was a Christian pastor. He was a dissident theologian during Adolf Hitler's genocide against the Jews in Germany and Europe. And as we know, for his opposition to the anti-Semitic genocidal ideology of Hitler and German fascism, Bonhoeffer was hanged in a concentration camp on April 9th, 1945. So almost exactly 80 years ago today. I want to say that I don't claim to know exactly what Bonhoeffer would say to us today as we confront the traumas in Israel and Palestine and Israel's devastation of Gaza, but I believe that we can discern precious wisdom from the way he responded to the atrocities and traumas of his own time, Mae, and that wisdom can still speak to us today. And so I just want to speak one word from Bonhoeffer to our current moment. And I'm going to quote from him a good bit because my intention is for us to hear Bonhoeffer in his own voice. I believe Bonhoeffer would say many things to us today, but let me simply mention one to begin this conversation. And that is this: recognize Christ in the dehumanized other. Recognize Christ in the dehumanized other. From start to finish, Bonhoeffer's moral vision was focused on the person of Jesus Christ. For Bonhoeffer, Jesus is the very center of our humanity and the revelation of God's will for our flourishing today. In one of Bonhoeffer's earliest lectures from 1928, he was only 22 years old, Bonhoeffer insisted, quote, Christ can still speak to us concerning the ultimate, final, decisive matters of our world, unquote. And certainly the trauma that we're discussing in Israel and Palestine tonight is one of these decisive matters for our time. But the question is where we can see, hear, and meet Jesus in our world today. Again, in 1928, Bonhoeffer made his answer to this question clear. He said, quote, Jesus Christ, God himself, speaks to us from every human being. I am for you, and you are for me, God's claim, unquote. And then, towards the very end of his life, before he was hanged in that concentration camp, Bonhoeffer wrote practically the same thing from his Nazi prison cell. He wrote, quote, our relationship to God is a new life in being there for others through participation in the being of Jesus. The transcendent is not the infinite, unattainable task, but the neighbor within reach in any given situation, God in human form, unquote. He says, if you want to find God, you don't have to go to some place that's infinite and unattainable. Just look at your neighbor and you are already in the presence of God in human form. So this was Bonhoeffer's moral vision from start to finish. Jesus is present in every human being, in every one of our neighbors. And thus, human life bears sacred, inviolable worth. Every single person is a temple of divine presence. And Bonhoeffer preached and practiced this vision of human dignity based on Jesus' teaching that he himself is present with people that the world sees as the least of these. Now, in contemporary language, we would say those are the dehumanized, the less, those who matter less and whose security and dignity are of less concern to us. Now, Bonhoeffer's vision of universal human dignity led him to this conclusion again in 1928. So this is the early Bonhoeffer when he's just 22 years old and he's already articulating his core convictions. He said, Christianity preaches the infinite worth of that which is seemingly worthless and the infinite worthlessness of that which is seemingly so valued. Unquote. So what our world sees as so precious, wealth, power, superior status, Christianity says is worthless, according to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And what our world sees as worthless, degraded people, dehumanized people, suffering people who are hungry, grieving, labeled as worthless enemies or terrorists, these people, authentic Christianity sees as infinitely precious, according to Bonhoeffer. Jesus himself is present with these dehumanized, genocided people. And so, in one of Bonhoeffer's sermons from 1932, this is just 1 year before Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, Bonhoeffer taught that Jesus is found, quote, among you outcasts and outlaws, you victims of society, you men and women without work, you broken down and ruined, you lonely and abandoned, rape victims, and those who suffer injustice, you who suffer in body and soul, unquote. With these prophetic words, Bonhoeffer is calling us to see a totally transfigured vision of humanity. The people we are tempted to see as less, as unwanted, as unworthy, as worthless are precious to God. Now, this moral vision led Bonhoeffer to write the following words in 1942. And these are some of the last words that Bonhoeffer wrote before he was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943. Bonhoeffer wrote, quote, "It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled. In short, from the perspective of the suffering." I just want to read that one more time. It's a bit of a mouthful, but these are profound words from Bonhoeffer. It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, the reviled. In short, from the perspective of the suffering. In many ways, it sounds like Bonhoeffer could be describing the rubble of Gaza and the communities in the West Bank. And so I think Bonhoeffer would ask us some questions as we consider the trauma of our time and the violence of our time. Can we see Christ in the dehumanized, suffering other? Do we consider Palestinians as equally precious to Israelis or to Americans or to we ourselves? Are we able to see the presence of God in the suffering neighbor from the perspective of below, from the perspective of the ruin, the rubble, the displacement from home? And I believe that here today, we can hear echoes of Bonhoeffer's voice in the words of Reverend Luther Isaac, who is inviting us to precisely that vision, to see Christ in the rubble, to see the presence of divine dignity in those that we have dehumanized. So let me simply start there, maybe with just a little bit of vision. How are we seeing others? And Bonhoeffer is certainly inviting us to see every other person as an expression of the presence of God, and so to enter in with a sense of dignity and compassion.
Thank you for that. My dissertation advisor, Dr. Clarence Walker, used to have an expression. He said, "Every other has another other." And Clarence Walker, one of the foremost scholars of Black American history at the University of California, Davis, wrote The Preacher and the Politician about Jeremiah Wright, and President Obama wrote a book called Mongrel Nation about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I wonder if the dehumanization, if some of what you're articulating, it depends on the posture of where you're coming from, on who the other might be. I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments about that expression, every other has another other.
Every other has another other. Yeah, it's a powerful statement. I think it's deeply true. I think Bonhoeffer is calling us to see every other as precious and worth, and to expand our vision so that those that we may be most tempted to overlook, to devalue, to see their suffering as less significant to us, to let our attention be attracted to those particular neighbors, to those particular others. For people who have been traumatized by the horrific attack on October 7th, of course, attention is going to be towards those so-called others who may have inflicted that pain. And for those who have experienced the retaliation for that violence 50-fold in the devastation of their homes, their communities, their families, their children, the attention is going to easily be on the Israeli side. where that bombardment and siege is coming from. And I think that Bonhoeffer is asking us to enter into a radical compassion where we can see every human life as bearing divine dignity. And I find one of his statements again in that essay towards the end of his life particularly challenging to me, to Andrew. He says, "Nothing that I despise in the other is foreign to myself."
Hmm.
Nothing that I despise in the other is foreign to myself. Maybe I see the other as immoral, as chaotic, as violent, as feeling pleasure in my pain, in feeling sadness when I succeed, in wanting me to live in fear, to feel like I have to kind of cringe or live in a posture of constant vigilance just for my own basic safety and dignity. I've done the work of discovering that those same things live inside of me. Sometimes I feel a little bit more when other people feel less. Sometimes I feel a little safer when maybe others feel a little threatened around me. Maybe I might feel like I'm a little bit more important when other people's presence is taken less seriously than mine. Or maybe I want, people to pay attention to my grief and the issues that are burning in my heart more than the grief and the suffering of other neighbors. So I recognize the wisdom of what Bonhoeffer is saying, that nothing that I despise in the other is foreign to myself. And so when we recognize that every other has another, I might say, okay, how do I start seeing my others? And directly going to that place and saying, what are the pain that they're suffering? What are the traumas that live inside them, those senses of grief, of danger, of humiliation, of radical loss? And how can I begin listening to their suffering, to their sorrow, to their sense of fear? So I think Bonhoeffer would be inviting us into a radical empathy that really begins in the posture of listening. And if I can just read one passage from Bonhoeffer for us about listening, May. Bonhoeffer wrote in his classic book, Life Together, "Listening can be a greater service than speaking. Many people seek a sympathetic ear and do not find it among Christians because these Christians are talking even when they should be listening. But Christians who can no longer listen to one another will soon no longer be listening to God either. They will always be talking, even in the presence of God. The death of the spiritual life starts here." And I would echo Bonhoeffer and say the death of the spiritual life begins when we can no longer see the divine dignity of our other or of someone else's other, and so enter into that posture of compassion and listening.
One of the things I think that's so profound that I feel like you just parsed for us. The reason Rabbi Or Rose was invited, I got to know him. He's at Hebrew College, and the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Fellows. It used to be the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, and then they became housed at Hebrew College. And he leads a center there, an interfaith center. And so I happen to be a Dietrich Bonhoeffer fellow because I wrote a chapter in the book that I wrote called Just Spirituality, How Faith Practices Fuel Social Action. And it's about spiritual practices. And so I actually wrote about Bonhoeffer's practices of prayer and the way he practiced prayer when he was in prison, and some of the prayers that he wrote, praying through the Psalms as a mechanism of centering and as a mechanism of staying centered on God. And it's funny that you mentioned that you the discipleship book. What's the name of it again? Not The Cost of Discipleship. The little book.
Life Together.
Life Together. Oh my goodness. When I was in university, I was discipled by that book. And then, I think I've read that book like 20 times. I still don't understand why you can't sing in harmony. Do you have an answer to that? He says you can't sing in harmony because it like causes competition or something.
I think that was what Bonhoeffer was on his mind, reducing a sense of competition, but yay to the cooperation of harmony singing.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So he's not right about everything. I mean, but sorry, that was all tangential. Um, there's something really profound about a transformative process that I feel like I want us to just press into a little bit. Um, when we encounter injustice, yes, we're talking about trauma, and I'm grateful that you talked about, those traumatized on October 7th. And sometimes in this space, when we look at perspectives, the occupation of the Palestinian people has been going on for decades, and so we're looking at a larger systemic injustice. Um, I don't think it's never wrong for us to show empathy for people who've been traumatized. And I've spent time in communities where people were killed on October 7th, and there are people who were traumatized, and mothers who lost their children, and like horrors were done that day, and there were massacres that day, and that day was an atrocity against God, just the way that every day that dozens of Palestinians are being killed in Gaza since then are atrocities against God. Like, I fundamentally believe that to be true. And there's very, very little space to be able to have that mutual empathy. Um, and and so some of the ways I've been seeking to understand this is, how do we relate as people and as humanity while also addressing systemic issues, right? Like the geopolitics and the systemic injustices. And yet, how do we relate as a common humanity? So that's one kind of dynamic. But there's this other dynamic of us as people. And I think for me, one of the things that I've said that I've learned or am learning, and don't even, I feel very inarticulate in this moment. I apologize. I was so struck the more I've worked on this issue about, I mean, I could tell stories that would articulate it in detail, but about things within me that are completely not of God, that became increasingly clear the more I engaged, after, as the days went on, after fall of 2023. And so identifying like the hatred in my own heart that has to be rooted out by God and has to be transformed, the othering that I do, right? The false prejudices, the supremacy, the privileges, the assumptions, all of those things that that I need to come to terms with. I think I've never like seen them more glaringly than as this has gone on. And I wonder if you can comment on that, because I feel like we're kind of talking about it, but it's a spiritual transformation issue. I mean, I did my second doctorate on spiritual formation on the process of learning to love your enemy, because if you work in the Middle East, even if you don't think you have enemies, other people think you're their enemy, right? And so I wanted to seek to understand, like, how do we become transformed to be like Christ, right? How do we do that? What's that look like? And do you think Bonhoeffer speaks to that, I guess, is my question.
Yes, I think Bonhoeffer definitely speaks to that, Mae. And there's so much that you've put on the table there in this. How do we enter into the spiritual practices necessary to live in this radical compassion? I just want to say, as a kind of intro, a lot of my experience is rooted in the Ethiopian Civil War in the Horn of Africa. And I noticed, Mae, that this war erupted in 2020, and it's estimated that 1.2 million people have been killed in this horrific violence. And I noticed that if you would express compassion for Tigrayans, for one group of people in Ethiopia, then a bunch of other people would think that you were on their side and you were against everyone else. And if you express compassion for the suffering of Amhara people, then it might get flipped around and you would be seen as the enemy of Tigrayans and as someone who had been co-opted or bought out by Amharas. Or if you express compassion for another group embroiled in that conflict, again, you would be labeled as being on their side and, like you said, being the enemy of everyone else. And it became a very, very tricky terrain where if you simply said, I am feeling deep grief when Tigrayan women are raped, and when Amhara women are raped, and when Oromo women are raped. A lot of people didn't know what to do with that because it seemed like love and compassion and grief needed to be focused only on one group. And I think Bonhoeffer would invite us into something so simple, May, but so incredibly profound that there is not a shortage of God's love. And so we don't need to extend God's love only to one group of people and compassion for only one group of sufferers. That when we begin to baptize ourselves in the ocean of divine love, we can begin to experience this openness of compassion for Palestinians who have been living under the systemic injustice that you named, for Palestinians that have been hungry and thirsty and killed and destroyed under the rubble of the bombardment that you described. We can also express deep and sincere compassion for Israelis and other people who were murdered on October 7th. And we don't need to feel like there is a competition in that expression of compassion, or that we have betrayed any one group of people because we've allowed our heart to open that wide. And I think that this takes us back to how Bonhoeffer understands prayer. Bonhoeffer understands prayer as the opening of the heart to the presence of God. Prayer is not primarily talking at God. Prayer is primarily opening ourselves to the presence of God and waiting on God and listening for God. And if we take Bonhoeffer seriously, that the presence of God is there in each person and with each person, then when we enter into prayer, we are entering into a posture of openness to every other person. And now, May, this is incredibly challenging work because a lot of us kind of maintain our psychological hygiene, our sense of psychological security by saying, okay, I'll have grief for those people, but I won't for them. And I'll read the stories about those people suffering, but I won't for them. And when those people are threatened or are under attack, I will raise my voice, I'll give my money, I'll address my representatives, I'll do everything in my power to make that stop. And when those people suffer, then I can just ignore it and say, isn't that sad? Bonhoeffer is calling us into this enlarged moral consciousness that comes through prayer when we wait on the presence of God and open ourselves to the presence of God. And when we learn to have that healing eye therapy, May, that vision therapy of seeing the presence of God in each human being, then that compassion begins to enlarge. And this takes us into that very uncomfortable space where maybe the quote unquote other side sees us as the enemy, and maybe some of our own people in our own community also see us as betraying them because we've expressed grief for those other human beings, those other neighbors. And I think that this is where Bonhoeffer would say that soaking in the presence of God, meditating on scripture, doing the grief work, like, my God, why have you forsaken me? Bonhoeffer returned to this text over and over again in his writings, doing the grief work of knowing those convulsive emotions that live inside of us is essential for maintaining this posture of deep compassion in the midst of trauma, where maybe those dear people and these dear people, they don't know what to do with me or with us, because our compassion is reaching out and expressing grief for all who are suffering, and not simply trying to build a kind of following or loyalty based on only speaking of one side suffering. So this spiritual practice is absolutely essential for maintaining resilience in this practice of compassion in the face of trauma, because it's very countercultural, and a lot of us, we don't know what to do with it. Again, I've had so many people who have told me, like, Andrew, you're anti-Israel, simply because I've expressed compassion for the suffering of Palestinian people. I mean, I remember I went to a mosque in in Indiana, and I heard a medical doctor, an American medical doctor who had volunteered in Gaza for a few weeks. She came back and she just told about her experience, and she could hardly speak because she was so overwhelmed, especially by the death of children, especially pregnant women who had given birth to children, and then those children would die overnight because maybe there was no electricity, or there was no medicine, or there was no water. But people have said to me, Andrew, you must be anti-Israel or even anti-Semitic, because I say that this suffering must stop, and all of us must raise our voice for it to stop. But then maybe some other people um, will feel threatened when I begin my remarks tonight by saying I feel deep sorrow for those people who were kidnapped and who were killed in that horrific violence. And none of us want to lose our constituency, the buy-in of those people whose loyalty we want. But this is the kind of countercultural work of compassion that I think requires the kind of prayerful spiritual practice that grounded Bonhoeffer's life, including when he was in prison for 2 years.
Right. Well, this is my last question, and I'll open it up for others to be able to engage. So I'd encourage you, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function. That'll be the easiest place to see them. Or if you have questions that you'd like to share, I will pay attention to the chat as well. So please do share your thoughts or questions there. We'd encourage that. We'd like to hear where you're interested and what your thoughts are, and the things that have provoked you, or what resonates, or what challenges you based on the things we've discussed thus far. I think, some of what we're talking about, and we won't be able to address this. So I'm glad we're having a part 2, and I'm glad Rabbi Orr will be joining us as well, because some of the thoughts that come to mind are, what about then prophetic witness? What about speaking out against injustice? What about, and the great criticism when you show empathy? We talk about a multi-narrative approach that respects the humanity of all people while not compromising on calling for human rights and addressing injustices, and that both can be true. And I fundamentally believe that they can be. I mean, God is the God of righteousness and justice, right? They are the foundations of his throne. And I talk all the time about dikaios and dikaiosune, the Greek word in the New Testament that means literally both righteousness and justice. And how I think this actually, Bonhoeffer's life, like, Bonhoeffer wasn't only, a moral ethicist, he was involved in a plot to kill Hitler and lost his life for it. So one of the things I said to Andrew before we began is, my understanding was that Bonhoeffer was a pacifist who became an interventionist. And so I'm interested if you agree that, or if you agree with that, or if you disagree with that, or what's it mean to stand up against injustice in light of what Bonhoeffer has to say? So there's this spiritual process that's, we talk about personal righteousness or right relationship with God. But what's that mean in terms of living out, right relationship with the world?
It's a big question, Mae. It's a big question. If I may, I'd like to just read some more words from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. These were words that, again, Bonhoeffer had spoken in 1934. So this is in the shadow of Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany. Bonhoeffer said, "Christianity stands or falls with its revolutionary protest against violence, arbitrariness, and pride of power, and with its defense for the weak." And then Bonhoeffer said, "I feel that Christianity is rather doing too little in showing these points than doing too much. Christianity has adjusted itself much too easily to the worship of power. It should give much more offense, much more shock to the world than it is doing. Christianity should take a more definite stand for the weak than to consider the potential moral right of the strong." I think this is the foundation of Bonhoeffer's ethical vision. Christianity stands and falls with its protest against violence, arbitrariness, and the pride of power. And this is clear all throughout Bonhoeffer's writings, that when you seek to discern the will of God, you see that God is fundamentally opposed to the use of force to destroy other human life. And May, in 1936, Bonhoeffer wrote a letter to a woman named Elizabeth Zinn. She was a friend of Bonhoeffer's, and Bonhoeffer said that after he had encountered the Sermon on the Mount and the teachings of Jesus, he said that Christian pacifism suddenly came into focus as something utterly self-evident. And then he said, I no longer saw or thought about anything else. So Bonhoeffer has this radical nonviolence at the very, very heart of his vision of following Jesus. And a lot of us should be reminded that Bonhoeffer was actually planning to go to India to study with Gandhi. And of course, that was interrupted by the rise of fascism in Germany and Nazism under Hitler. But that was Bonhoeffer's intention, to go study nonviolence with Gandhi, like Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr. did in the birth of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the United States. I just want to put a couple other pieces on the table here. Bonhoeffer was very, very clear that he thought that modern warfare had become catastrophic in its scale of destruction, and he fundamentally condemned it. You can find these documents in volume 11 of Bonhoeffer's collected works, in a speech that he gave in 1932, where he said, modern warfare destroys the body and soul of humanity, and it becomes this kind of ratcheting up conflict of mutual self-destruction. And so Bonhoeffer was crystal clear that he thought that the use of warfare to resolve conflicts was fundamentally against the will of God. He said, the order of international peace is God's commandment for us today. Today's war destroys soul and body because there is no way for us to understand war as an order of preservation, as a way that God is trying to preserve justice in our world. Bonhoeffer thought destroying human life in the name of seeking justice was ultimately meaningless. And so he said, we must face the next war with all the power of resistance, rejection, and condemnation. Now, I want to be clear that this is precisely why Dietrich Bonhoeffer believed that Adolf Hitler needed to be removed from office as the dictator of Germany. Hitler had refused to enter into peaceful negotiation to resolve the horrific violence of World War II, and of course, the horrific atrocity of the genocide against the Jewish people. And so Bonhoeffer thought that Adolf Hitler as a single individual needed to be removed from power. He was not justifying war, Mae. He was not justifying some kind of use of military force to try to take out Hitler. He thought that a targeted strategic attempt to remove Hitler from power was what had become necessary in order to re-engage peaceful negotiations to end the war through a non-military means. And I just want to add, because a lot of people miss these details that are important for getting Bonhoeffer right. Bonhoeffer thought that trying to kill Hitler was a sin against God. And he thought that the people who were involved in that plot needed to repent. They needed to acknowledge that they were violating their neighbor in trying to take the life of Adolf Hitler. But Bonhoeffer thought that sin had become necessary in that moment of catastrophic violence against the Jewish people and the other neighbors of Germany. So there was no sense of like, we're in the right, a kind of triumphalism, let's take them out. Bonhoeffer was heartbroken and deeply troubled by this move. I also want to name, and a lot of people miss this too, Bonhoeffer was not involved in the plot to kill Adolf Hitler. He was aware of it, and he thought that it had become necessary. But Bonhoeffer himself was not involved in the plot, and he was actually arrested because of his avoidance of military service. Bonhoeffer had tried to work different means, including joining the German military intelligence, to avoid serving in the German military because he refused to take up violence and harm other people. And so Bonhoeffer himself, to the very end, he was against the use of war. He said it's catastrophic in scale. It can't achieve the righteousness or the justice of God. He thought that Hitler needed to be removed in order to restore peaceful negotiation instead of one side dominating another and imposing its will on them. And Bonhoeffer thought that even when you were trying to remove this single individual to open the way for negotiation, that even that was a sin against God that required a spirit of humble repentance and a recommitment to the way of peace, even to his own personal suffering. So it's a very, very complex question, Mae, but I would say that I don't think you can invoke Dietrich Bonhoeffer if you want an ethic of interventionism today, and at least if we're talking about a military scale intervention where you have one army or one military going to battle against another. I think Bonhoeffer would say, no, you can't do that. And in fact, another reason why Bonhoeffer was originally arrested, Mae, was because he was helping other German pastors evade being enlisted into the German military. He was seen as defying the you can read the documents of Bonhoeffer's arrest in volume 16 of the complete works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and they said that he had defied the authority of the German military by helping people escape service. So you can see that even to the very end, Bonhoeffer was saying, look, we need to find other solutions to our problems rather than trying to dominate and kill one another.
That's really interesting because, one of the things, so Ron Sider, again, was my dissertation advisor, and he's written amazing books on nonviolence. And he says one of the reasons nonviolence hasn't worked historically is we've never employed it adequately. And he says nonviolence movements, when they, and he uses India, and he uses Gandhi as an example. When nonviolent movements are grow enough, they can absorb death where people in the movements die, and death occurs, but the movement does not die. And that the movement has to actually be strong enough to be able to carry the death of individuals as a cost, right? So this is a bit of the cost of, this is a material cost, right? The cost of violence as a mechanism of nonviolence is a part of what he talks about in terms of why it doesn't work.
Big time, big time. And I just want to put on the table there, Mae, there's a researcher, a professor of political science at Harvard University named Erica Chenoweth. And Chenoweth has done research from 1900 to 2019. So over 100 years. And Chenoweth has looked at over 627 cases of violent conflict. And what Chenoweth found is that nonviolent resistant movements have been twice as effective at avoiding or of resolving violent conflict and stopping this cycle of cyclical, expanding, spiraling conflict. And what Chenoweth found is that when 3.5% of a population becomes organized in a nonviolent resistance campaign, the nonviolent campaign always works. And that's describing what you're saying about a movement being able to absorb death. And here, Mae, I think another aspect of Bonhoeffer's theology is extremely important. We're getting closer to Easter. Bonhoeffer took the resurrection seriously. His final words before he was hanged at the Flossenburg prison camp were, "This is for me the end, but also the beginning of life." He was able to name, it's coming to an end for me. My journey is finished here. I'm about to be hanged. But this is also the beginning of life. And the defiant hope of resurrection power takes the power away from death in a nonviolent campaign, because we can be killed but not ended. Jesus made this really brilliant, powerful distinction in his teaching between dying and being destroyed. We're all going to die, whether today or tomorrow or in 50 years. But Jesus says that in the resurrection, we are not destroyed. This was core to Bonhoeffer's faith, and it was part of his courage to risk his life against German fascism, German genocide, because he believed that if he was killed, that wasn't the end of his journey. And I wonder how many of us have embraced the social and political implications of the resurrection, Mae, that it's okay to die. It's okay to suffer. It's okay to lose our lives. Of course, we want no one to lose their lives prematurely and for all to experience dignity and security. But if we are resisting a catastrophic totalitarian regime of violence, then absorbing death, as you called it, may be necessary. And we saw that in the civil rights campaign. And the last speech of Martin Luther King Jr., he said, I've been to the mountaintop. He said, I may not make it to the promised land, but it doesn't even matter now because I've been able to see it. He said, my eyes have seen the glory of the Lord. And so Martin Luther King Jr. was willing to lay down his life for this nonviolent struggle. And of course, May, if we look at the history of white supremacy in the United States, it was in the law, it was in the culture, it was extraordinarily violent and cruel and deadly. And yet we see this patient, prophetic, courageous movement of civil rights that was fundamentally nonviolent begin uprooting and overthrowing this regime of white supremacy without unleashing massive traumas in the United States. This is extraordinary. I think it's still a powerful witness to the potential of organized nonviolence, like Chenoweth is talking about, when we get behind it, and especially when we have the courage of resurrection hope with like Bonhoeffer. Then we don't have to see death as the ultimate failure or the ultimate loss. And I know this sounds like crazy talk in American society, and maybe even in some American Christianity, because we say, well, yeah, I'll go to heaven when I die. But when it actually comes to laying down our lives for the love of our neighbors, many of us see that as very extreme, as very radical. Even though this was the practice of Jesus and all of his first followers, his first practitioners. And so I think we have to revisit
Well,
the
the
ethical
very first
implications.
thesis I ever wrote was on voluntary martyrdom. And so you can go to the opposite extreme where people would seek to be martyrs so that they could get, the most honorable death, right? So, I mean, which has parallels. I mean, we could talk about how that relates to this moment today too. There's so many things I could talk about in terms of violence and in terms of, even how this relates to South Africa and how this relates to, racism. And one of the questions we have is how does this relate to the world today in terms of Christianity in the US and Trump? This conversation specifically about the Middle East, this is part 3. There have been 2 other parts of this series that I know. One focused on Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. I know one focused on, I think, the Bonhoeffer film. And I think there's another one coming up as well that'll focus on more broadly, this moment in U.S. context. But even the things you were talking about in the civil rights movement and xenophobia and racism, and I mean, so many of those things, are resurfacing that have not been addressed. They might have been codified in laws and they're being overturned right now, right? So we could talk about all those things. There's so much content. But I do want to get to some of the questions. One of the questions we had is, why don't I ever hear from voices of Afro-Palestinians? And I don't know if you had a response to that. I can respond to that. Or if you had something that you wanted to say, Andrew, why don't I ever hear from the voices of Afro-Palestinians?
I'll let you respond to that, May, but just a brief comment from me. I was recently at Reverend Munther Isaac's speech at Wheaton College, and I was sitting next to a very dear African American friend, and someone in the audience had asked Reverend Munther, how can we learn to see what the Palestinian experience is like today when we live so far away from them? And my dear African American brother leaned over to me and he said, talk with Black people. And so I think that there is witness happening. And again, I wonder, how much are we listening, like Bonhoeffer said? And again, Bonhoeffer said that we're doing a lot of talking over one another. We're not doing a lot of listening. So I think a lot of that witness is there, including among our Black neighbors. But let me pass it back over to you.
Sure. And I would just say we don't have strong relationships with the Afro-Palestinian community. If there are people that specifically, we'd be happy to be introduced. My understanding is it's a very small community in Palestine, less than 1%. But we'd be happy to know, people within that community. We do, in terms of, it's a very different community, the African American community here, but we do partner with Black Christians for Palestine and a number of communities here. We just did an event. One of the events we did with Munther was just with Cori Bush. And, one of the things we were talking about is, to your point, in terms of the US context, Andrew, Cori Bush was the representative who brought forward the ceasefire resolution, but brought forward the resolution specifically where Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And, one of my mentors, I remember telling the story of being in Ferguson shortly thereafter Michael Brown's murder. And the woman that was my mentor is African American, and she had never been to Palestine. And she tells the story of a young Palestinian woman who was in America, in Ferguson, who took her hand and raised her hand, in the air and said, "From Ferguson to Palestine." And so there are a lot of connections, of course, between the African American community here and the Palestinian community. But so yes, happy to be introduced more in that context. I see Stevens has a comment. He said, "Thank you for the challenging words and conversation. In view of Bonhoeffer's invitation to recognize Christ in every human being, can you speak to how to recognize Christ in the perpetrator or the tyrant?"
Oh, it's such a wonderful question, Stephen. Thank you for it. It's very challenging. Bonhoeffer left behind 16 volumes of writing. He died when he was 39, but he left behind a lot of words, and I've read through all of them. And I don't remember a space in Bonhoeffer's writings where he just unleashed on Hitler with insults and with degrading language or with dehumanizing language. Bonhoeffer was radically committed to speaking and practicing respect in the presence of others, even when he fiercely disagreed with the injustice and the violence that they were perpetrating. And if I can, May, just one other small passage from Bonhoeffer that I find relevant to this question and just very challenging. I originally had 6 points that I wanted to mention tonight, and the last was to speak. Bonhoeffer would have us speak a word of radical hope. Bonhoeffer wrote from his prison cell, "Blessing means laying one's hand on something and saying, 'Despite everything, you belong to God.' This is what we do with the world that inflicts such suffering on us. Despite everything, you belong to God." And I think that this basic posture of compassion towards the perpetrator, towards the tyrant, allows us to begin asking curious questions. What is the insecurity in the tyrant or the perpetrator that makes them feel like they need to be in a position of domination in order to be safe? Of course, a lot of times domination presents itself as coming from pride, from superiority, but I believe very strongly that positions of domination are always rooted in a profound insecurity. And when you can lay your hand on the perpetrator and say, "Despite everything, you belong to God," then I can begin asking, I wonder what it is. Why are they so insecure that they feel like they need to use violence to dominate, to be safe? What is the insecurity in their own sense of self-esteem and their own identity that makes them feel like they have to be superior in order to be enough? And how can I look in the face of that tendency towards superiority, towards domination, and to see what I despise in myself? Again, to return to that passage I mentioned earlier, where Bonhoeffer says, "Nothing that I despise in the other is foreign from myself." Now, I realize this is extremely challenging work. I said a lot of my work is rooted in the Ethiopian context and work against the Ethiopian Civil War. And it was very, very difficult for me to resist using insulting words, degrading words, dehumanizing words against the perpetrators of such extraordinary misery and suffering in the Ethiopian context. And yet this was part of my spiritual practice. And I really learned that from Bonhoeffer, that when you begin seeing the blessing of God reaching out and holding all of us including the perpetrators of violence, then I can begin asking these critical but compassionate questions. What is the source of this insecurity? Where is this need to be more than others rooted? And how can we get to the root cause of that insecurity, that deficit in the sense of dignity or self-esteem or safety that is driving this need to step on other people, this need to reduce other people, this need to make other people feel afraid or to feel like they don't matter as much as we do. So I think Bonhoeffer might guide us towards a bit of this posture.
Beverly Henkel wrote, Saint Benedict and the Quakers would say, see the peace of Christ in the other, though they may not consider that they have a piece of God in them. They and all of us are made in the image of abode, thus relating to the other works. So I think that's beautiful. Yes. I'll ask a follow-up question as well. This has to do, I see other questions came in I'm sorry, I was remiss in reading the follow-up questions that came. I'll ask a question for me, and then there are two other questions that came in. This has to do with the role of violence, because, I've spent some time in South Africa lately, and I've been learning a lot about Nelson Mandela, and I'd read The Long Walk to Freedom, and I've been spending time working alongside actually the South African Council of Churches, many of whom actually knew and were a part of the anti-apartheid movement, and Christian followers of Christ. And one of the things that I've learned or am learning about Nelson Mandela's view of violence. And he says this in The Long Walk of Freedom. He says that the oppressor is the one who determines the mechanism by which the oppressed will seek their freedom. And so he says that the anti-apartheid movement tried nonviolence and it didn't work. And then essentially that violence was a tool. Now he didn't it actually seems like in some ways it's similar to Bonhoeffer. Like, he didn't esteem violence. He didn't think that like violence was like, a tool to be lauded, but that it was like a necessary evil because I guess to be able to address the injustices. And so he never, he was offered the ability to be able to be released for prison if he would renounce violence, and he was not willing to do so. And then ultimately, of course, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And, of course, we heroify these leaders later on and kind of, only pick and choose parts of the story that we want to tell. And I'm just curious, what you think Bonhoeffer would say to that, particularly in light of what's happening in the Middle East right now, where, Gaza has been under siege for more than a month, and we're more than 500 days into, Gaza being bombed and ongoing atrocities.
I think Bonhoeffer would call us to resist mirroring the behavior of the aggressor. I think Bonhoeffer would remind us that the normalization of violence to keep us safe is the ultimate recruiting mechanism of extremism, of the perpetuation of violence, of what some people call terrorism. Today, the bombardment, the siege, the starvation that we see taking place has got to be one of the most effective campaigns of radicalization that I have seen in my lifetime. When you live under that humiliation, that indignity, that terror on a daily basis, it's very, very difficult to resist not seeing the aggressor as less than human, as demonic, as an animal that needs to be slaughtered. And so I think that particularly followers of Jesus in the United States need to do everything that we can to resist the normalization of violence, and we need to appeal to all of our political representatives to say pressure must be put on the state of Israel to stop bombing Gaza, and that a passionate commitment to seeking a non-military solution is essential. Because as long as we continue depending on the use of violence to solve this crisis, we are radicalizing and radicalizing and radicalizing. And in the process, we are normalizing trauma. May this conversation began with wisdom about how to heal trauma. When we turn to violence as a source of safety, we are normalizing trauma and re-traumatization, injury and re-injury. And so I think Bonhoeffer would urge us to use our democratic freedoms and to use the public platforms of the churches in the United States in particular to raise our voice to say that the use of violence to solve this horrific war must be condemned. And this involves rejecting the arming of the Israeli military and the funding of this mass suffering and death. But I think Bonhoeffer, again, would be a very countercultural voice in our culture today, just like he was in his own, because he would refuse to say, don't allow the aggressor to define the terms of engagement, but rather, again, like Paul said, to be transformed by the renewing of your mind, to enter into a radical creativity, to enter into a radical posture of service and sacrifice, and so to resist perpetuating the conditions that make people feel like, of course, violence is the only way to be safe. Of course, killing those people is the only way to be safe. Of course, eliminationism, getting rid of whole groups of people, is the only way for us to feel at home. Bonhoeffer would say, if we continue down this track, again, he has this powerful passage in his writings where he says, we call it hope and we're left with fields of corpses. And isn't that what we see today?
You answered this a bit in the comments that you just made, but Pastor Russell Young, or Russell, just Dr. Russell Young, sorry, just asked this question. Thank you for this conversation. If he were an American Christian today, how would he engage this particular administration, the Trump administration around Palestine? What concrete actions would he promote in a nonviolent movement? And relatedly, how would he relate to the white evangelical church regarding Palestine and Israel?
It's a really big question, and I'm grateful for it. I'd like to point out that Bonhoeffer was an integral part of organizing an alternative movement inside German Christianity that was called the Confessing Church. Bonhoeffer observed that the institutionalized Christianity of German culture had gotten behind the philosophy that so-called Aryan or white Germans were superior to other Germans. So Bonhoeffer was part of making what was called the Barmen Declaration. This was this public declaration of the rejection of this form of German Christianity. He was part of founding the Confessing Church, saying, look, we need to have alternative Christian communities of formation, of worship, of witness, of resistance. And of course, Bonhoeffer was involved in leading the Finkenwalde community. This was a preacher's seminary. It was a dissident theology school where Christian leaders were coming together to be educated in a form of Christian theology that did not perpetuate the authoritarianism, the dehumanization, the totalitarianism that was at the heart of what was happening in Germany. And so I think Bonhoeffer would ask us, are we making our public statements to say the people who are being dehumanized in our society, including Palestinians, are bearers of the presence of Christ? Are we organizing Christian communities in conversations like this, where we are lifting up the dignity of those who have been called criminals, those who have been called animals, or those who have been called devils, and say, no, these are bearers of the precious image of God? Are we forming theological centers where we can critique Christian Zionism? Of course, Christian Zionism is an ideology that says some people are more chosen by God than others. And so some people's safety and dignity is more significant than others? Are we forming centers of theological imagination, of learning, of witness, of organizing that say, no, we reject Christian Zionism because we believe that all people have been chosen by God and who are bearers of this divine dignity. And so I think Bonhoeffer would be involved in this kind of making public statements, of creating centers of alternative worship, of forming communities of radical dissident theology that say, look, all people, the rape victim, the one you call the criminal, the one that you see as less than yourself is a bearer of Christ. And if you turn your face against them or away from them, you've turned your face away from Christ. I think Bonhoeffer would be involved in this kind of witness today. And I think, again, we can hear echoes of what Bonhoeffer was teaching in witnesses like Reverend Munter Isaac. And I would encourage everyone who's listening to this to buy Reverend Munter's book, Christ in the Rubble, and see how is he analyzing what's going on in contemporary society? How is he interpreting speeches where we hear this degrading speech being used by Christians in order to minimize the dignity of others? And how is he lifting up again the dignity of all people while again calling out the normalized injustices and violences that we've come to see as fundamentally acceptable? So I'm very appreciative of the question, but it's a massive one. It's a massive one.
It is. Yes, I think it is. I mean, I was really intrigued, the endorsement of your book that was describing Bonhoeffer's day, that was on the cover, which I had it pulled up, of course, and now that I'm like looking for it, I can't find it. But the way that David Gushee described your book, actually, I felt like could have been a summary of this moment in terms of the US in so many ways. And many people, I mean, one of the reasons this series came up for Evangelicals for Justice was the question of, is this a Bonhoeffer moment, right? Like, and what's that mean? And then a little bit of like co-opting. And so what did Bonhoeffer teach? And what was, and is it scriptural, or how do the scriptures speak to it? And does this moment call for a confessing church that is, because of, I was at the National Prayer Breakfast and we were locked in the room with the surprise that, there was a guest speaker who was coming, who was not supposed to be in the room. And, in walked President Trump, and I got down on my knees. I told the table before he walked in, I didn't know if it was going to be him or Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I said, I just want you to know, I don't know how to, in good conscience, be present. And so I thought, what better place than a prayer breakfast to be in prayer? But, he spoke for 40 some minutes, and I felt like that was the only way that I could, seek to be present when I felt, I'm speaking completely for myself right now. I felt like my faith was so bastardized that I didn't know how to do so with integrity and be in the room. And so this moment is calling those of us who, identify ourselves as followers of Christ to question, what's it mean, when the church is lying, when Christian nationalism is so prevalent, and when the state is making decisions that are causing so much harm. And I'm saying that as, we're speaking about the Middle East. Today, there was a vote. I don't know if it happened or what the outcome was, but Bernie Sanders was supposed to be putting forward, his resolution to combat the $8.8 million or $1 billion, or I normally have my notes in front of me, in Congress today, opposing weapons sales to Israel. And so the US is so complicit in what's happening in Gaza. And so less Democrats voted for it. Less Democrats voted to oppose weapons sales to Israel today than they did in November. So 15 voted to oppose weapons sales to Israel, and 19 voted in November. So what's this moment call us to? when there are people dying every day. And, part of our approach at Churches for Middle East Peace has been calling for a comprehensive permanent ceasefire for the sake of all, not only for the sake of those who are being killed. I mean, for the sake of Palestinians, because they are created in the image of God. I feel like there's a moral argument to be made that we should stop killing because killing is wrong and people are created in the image of God. And then, we sought to make this argument with the Biden administration and the argument didn't work. And so then there was like this pragmatic argument. If you won't stop for the sake of Palestinian children, stop for the sake of the people of Israel, that the longer the bombing of Israel goes on, the more the state of Israel becomes a pariah state, which is detrimental not only to the state, but to Jewish people in Israel and around the world. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. I mean, Chuck Schumer has said as much, right? He's the highest ranking Jewish, person ever elected to a U.S. position. And so there's pragmatic arguments to be made. And then we had what we called the persistent widow strategy, which was just the continue to call for an end to war and violence, with like the persistent widow, to call for justice. And so that's what we're inviting people to do, to continue to call for an end to violence, to call for the humanization of all people. Palestinians in Gaza, in the occupied Palestinian territories, Israelis, be they Jewish, Palestinian, a call for the humanization of all. So my very last question for you, and then we'll close, Andrew. I have heard it said, I don't know if this is true, that Matthew 16:24 was Bonhoeffer's favorite verse. Then they said to Jesus, or Jesus said to his disciples, if a person would follow me, they should deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. And I don't know if in all of his readings, if that was his favorite verse, but certainly Bonhoeffer's cost of discipleship is about taking up our cross. What do you think that verse would mean to Bonhoeffer, particularly in this moment?
Yes. I think the call to take up the cross is the call to see Christ in the dehumanized. The crucified in Roman society were the throwaways. They were the people that you could turn into a spectacle of powerlessness, of humiliation, of pain, and say, don't cross us. Don't mess with us. If you do, we're going to kill you. That's what happened to Jesus. That's what happened to countless people in the time of Jesus who were crucified. And so when Bonhoeffer reminds us to take up our cross and follow Jesus, he's reminding us, see the presence of Christ in those dehumanized people who have been emptied of value, who have been erased from our conscience, whose trauma doesn't appeal to our grief. And I would simply add to that, Mae, that for those of us who read Bonhoeffer, maybe the verse that he quoted most often was Matthew 25. Whatever you do to the least of these, you have done to Jesus. I have a document that lists all of the references in Bonhoeffer's work, and it's just relentless throughout his writings from beginning to end. And I think that this is part of what it means to take up the cross. When you see Christ in the other, your society won't know what to do with you, because so much of society, identity, belonging is organized around crucifixions. Who can we get rid of, cancel, erase? Whose suffering doesn't need to matter to us? And Bonhoeffer is saying, well, if you begin to see the presence of God in other people, then their pain will matter to you. And so your society might become a little confused about who you really are and what you stand for. And so, yes, I would say that this is very much a moment that's calling for conscience, for moral awareness. And Bonhoeffer would say, take up our cross, but not in some kind of abstract religious sense of just quoting a Bible verse. He would say, take up your cross by entering into costly solidarity with those who have been dehumanized, who have been thrown away, who have been made sufferers without the grief of those who should be crying out for their safety.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm grateful for time with you. I'd encourage you all. Bonhoeffer's New Beginning, Ethics After Devastation is the name of Andrew's book on Bonhoeffer, Bonhoeffer's New Beginning. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. We put some links in the chat So E4J, we put a donation link. You can become a member of E4J. So there's a link to a form there. We put links to the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. CMEP, Churches for Middle East Peace, has a bulletin. It's a weekly bulletin where we seek to curate news. We're still doing daily updates every day, curating news from news sources from throughout the Middle East, Jewish news sources, Arab news sources. We read the State Department readouts. And so we do a weekly update live every Thursday. That's about 30 minutes or less every Thursday, summarizing the week's news, and then try to do a 10-minute update. We've done it every single day since October 7th. So those are some resources for you to stay informed. We have action alerts. We're continuing to call on our members of Congress. We're calling for the withholding of weapons because they are being used in violation of international law for the sake of all human lives. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's a gift to be with you. And I look forward. Thank you for your willingness to do this again with Rabbi Orr. I'm really, really grateful for the conversation.
I continue to be so grateful to be with you, Mae, and I eagerly look forward to the conversation with Rabbi Orr. Blessings to all. Despite everything, we belong to God.
That is a good truth to hold on to. So thank you for that. Thank you. And for the model that Bonhoeffer gave us also as well, of being faithful in the most challenging of circumstances. So thank you everyone for joining us. All right. God bless.